The Dark Lord in the headmaster's chair. What if Voldemort was never the real threat? What if the true Dark Lord sat every year in the headmaster's chair, half-moon spectacles glinting, gently offering lemon drops to the children he was grooming? Today, we deconstruct a timeline where Albus Dumbledore is the villain of the Harry Potter saga. In the original series, Dumbledore is the closest thing the story has to a benevolent godfather, omniscient, eccentric, occasionally fallible, but fundamentally safe. But power is rarely so benign. Imagine the psychological fracture when you rewatch the very first scene: a baby on a doorstep, a cat that is a woman watching, and Dumbledore calmly placing Harry into the arms of people he knows will hate magic. The subtext is brutal. This is no tragic necessity. This is controlled trauma. Now run a rapid montage in your head. The twinkle in Dumbledore's eyes at the sorting feast as Harry begs the hat not to send him to Slytherin. The quiet satisfaction when the hat changes its mind. The way Dumbledore smiles, almost indulgently, as an 11-year-old repeatedly breaks school rules to hunt a Dark Lord. The calm endorsement of Dumbledore's army, a secret militia of frightened teenagers, trained in combat magic under the school's nose. Under this premise, every one of those moments stops reading as whimsical. They read as structural grooming. The core issue is mechanical. If Dumbledore is evil, then every mistake he makes must still obey the internal logic of the timeline. Leaving Harry at the Dursleys is no longer an unfortunate side effect of Blood Wards. It becomes the first move in a long psychological conditioning program. Delaying the truth about the prophecy and the Horcruxes stops being paternal caution and becomes information control, the classic dynamic of an abuser who needs his weapon, both desperate and loyal. This is where the emotional stakes spike. This isn't a fun hat swap where we simply trade robes between Dumbledore and Voldemort. It's the horror of realizing that the one adult the narrative begs us to trust may have been the architect of every danger, every death, every lesson in suffering. When Cedric dies, when Sirius falls, when children stand in front of killing curses, we no longer ask, why didn't Dumbledore do more? We ask, what if he did exactly enough? So the guiding question of this essay is not just, what if Dumbledore was evil? It is, how far can we push that idea before the entire saga snaps? And how many supposed plot holes suddenly become clues? Why does he let an unstable Remus Lupin teach during full moons? Why is a cursed defense post tolerated for decades? Why is Snape's loyalty bound to Lily's death and a pre-planned murder on the astronomy tower? Under an evil Dumbledore, their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. In the next sections, the divergence is finalized. We move backward to his youth with Grindelwald, to Ariana's death, to a man who never truly abandoned the greater good. He just refined the public relations. Then we track forward, re-engineering the first Wizarding War, the prophecy, and the final battle so that Voldemort is not the ultimate enemy, but a rival project. The turning point arrives when we stop asking how Dumbledore saved the world and start asking what kind of world he was quietly building instead. Redrawing the origin when Albus chose the dark path. To understand that project, we deconstruct a timeline. We go back to the one summer where Albus Dumbledore was not a headmaster, not a legend, but a brilliant, angry boy in Godric's Hollow. Canon gives us the outline. A grieving son, trapped with an unstable sister and a resentful brother, finds in Gellert Grindelwald a mirror that flatters his intellect and his rage. Together, they sketch a new reality, wizards, for the greater good, guiding muggles, not through crude slaughter, but through enlightened dominance. It is conquest written in elegant handwriting. They plan Hallows, revolution, a new world order. Then, Ariana dies. In the original books, that duel is the moral car crash that halts Albus. The trauma is so great that he spends the rest of his life fearing his own power, refusing the ministry, delaying decisions because he does not trust himself. That is the public story. That is the myth. In this alternate structure, the turning point arrives in the same courtyard, with the same flash of spells and the same body on the ground, but the internal conclusion is different. Albus does not simply think, I must never seek power again. He thinks, with terrifying clarity, open revolution is unstable, it breaks, it kills the wrong people. The core issue is mechanical, not that domination is wrong, but that the method is inefficient, noisy, vulnerable to backlash. The subtext is brutal. Ariana's death does not erase the ideology of the greater good, it refines it. His guilt becomes a design brief. If the world can be quietly engineered so that no obscurial child, no Ariana, ever suffers again, then the sacrifice of one girl can be redeemed by the salvation of thousands. The equation is obscene, but internally coherent. This is how his psychological fracture heals, not by abandoning control, but by professionalizing it. So the divergence is finalized not with an oath of repentance, but with a shift in tactics. Grindelwald will go loud, banners, prisons, visible tyranny. Dumbledore will go quiet. He recognizes that in a modern, bureaucratic magical society, the real levers are trust, institutions, and narrative. Why seize the ministry and invite fear when you can become the man every minister privately fears to disappoint? That is why, in this timeline, he still turns down the minister's chair, not from humility, but from strategy. Hogwarts offers a renewable crop of impressionable minds. The International Confederation and the Wiesengemot offer global reach. His Order of Merlin and defeat of Grindelwald cement an untouchable moral reputation. A Dark Lord with a skull mask is obvious. A Dark Lord with a lemon drop is structurally invisible. Meanwhile, the wizarding world clings to its illusion. They believe Dumbledore is the conscience of their age, the one fixed point of loyalty and light. In reality, he has simply changed tools, not goals. The boy who once drew maps of conquest with Grindelwald now draws timetables, school policies, and war plans with the same cold precision, which raises the next question. If Voldemort rises in a world already curated by this older project, is he really an independent threat or an asset to be managed? Rewriting the First War, letting Voldemort rise. In this configuration, Voldemort is not a catastrophe, he is an opportunity. The public story paints Dumbledore as the reluctant champion, dragged into opposition by Tom Riddle's atrocities. But if we deconstruct a timeline where Dumbledore never abandons the greater good, his role shifts from resistor to curator. He watches Tom's ascent the way an engineer watches pressure build in a controlled system. Dangerous, yes, but also exquisitely useful if vented at the right moment. The core issue is mechanical. Tom Riddle passes through Hogwarts under Dumbledore's direct observation, leaving a trail of psychological fractures and terrified classmates. In canon, this reads as a teacher's unease. Here, it becomes data collection. Dumbledore interviews the boy in the orphanage, tracks his obsession with trophies, notes his charisma and cruelty, and does not intervene. Why would he? A future Dark Lord solves several structural problems at once. He externalizes fear, unites factions, and justifies centralizing power in the hands of whoever can defeat him. Consider the Gaunt Ring. Canonically, Dumbledore discovers it late, is cursed, and pays the price of delay. In this darker reading, the delay is intentional. He recognizes the ring's nature, deduces the Horcrux mechanism, and chooses not to publicize the breakthrough. By letting Riddle continue his experiments, Dumbledore acquires a living laboratory in immortality, a rival who will never willingly retire, and thus a permanent rationale for temporary emergency measures. The diary follows the same pattern. A sentient fragment of soul infiltrates Hogwarts, possesses a student, and nearly kills several children. Dumbledore, the greatest living legilimens, fails to detect it for an entire year, or he watches, taking note of how a sliver of Voldemort's consciousness manipulates trauma and memory in Ginny Weasley, measuring the psychological yield of fear on 11-year-olds. The subtext is brutal, the school is a test chamber, and the acceptable casualty rate is non-zero. Enter the Order of the Phoenix. On the surface, a band of loyal idealists resisting tyranny. Underneath, a prototype chessboard. Dumbledore filters intelligence, withholds key information about Horcruxes, and quietly decides which missions are expendable. Gideon and Fabian Prewett, Marlene McKinnon. They died bravely, he will say. In this timeline, the sentence has a second clause, he never speaks aloud, and their deaths were strategically informative. He studies Voldemort's raids, his recruitment patterns, his use of terror as a scheduling tool. Then, the turning point arrives in the Hog's head. Sybil Trelawney speaks the prophecy. In canon, Dumbledore rushes to protect it. Here, his reaction is colder. A prophecy is not just a warning, it is a blueprint. He allows enough of it to reach Voldemort through Snape to trigger action, but not enough to grant true understanding. The divergence is finalized the moment he realizes he can manufacture a chosen one from infancy, raised under controlled deprivation at Privet Drive, bound to him by gratitude, guilt, and isolation. From that point, Dumbledore does not merely oppose Voldemort, he midwives him. He ensures the Dark Lord rises high enough and falls bloodily enough that the wizarding world's claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. Only then will they accept any safeguard he proposes. But if Voldemort is a managed asset and Harry is a manufactured weapon, what exactly is Dumbledore building toward, and who survives contact with that endgame? The boy who was used, Harry's childhood as a ritual. To understand that endgame, we go back to the beginning, to a ruined cottage, a crying child, and a man who does not see a tragedy. He sees an opportunity. In Godric's Hollow, the divergence is finalized the moment Dumbledore arrives. Canon frames him as distant but grieving, the reluctant custodian of a war orphan. In this timeline, he steps through the wreckage, already calculating. Here is a prophecy, still humming in the air. Here is a Dark Lord, disembodied but not destroyed. And here, impossibly alive amid the rubble, is a baby who has just survived a killing curse by anchoring a shard of Voldemort's soul, a living Horcrux, bonded to the very threat that just terrorized the world. The core issue is mechanical. A prophecy without an instrument is only noise. A Horcrux without a handler is only a disaster. Dumbledore realizes, in one terrible instant, that Harry can be both. If he controls the boy, he controls the rhythm of the next war, the tempo of Voldemort's return, and the conditions under which the wizarding world will beg for his guidance. The subtext is brutal. He does not ask how to heal this child, he asks how to shape him. That is where the Dursleys stop being a regrettable compromise and become a design choice. Yes, Lily's blood magic offers protection if Harry lives with her sister. That part is true, but in this reality, Dumbledore does not merely accept the emotional aridity of number 4 Privet Drive, he requires it. Vernon's contempt, Petunia's unresolved trauma, Dudley's casual violence. These are not unfortunate side effects. They are the environmental conditions of a long psychological spell. Every birthday ignored is a controlled deprivation. Every night in the cupboard is enforced insignificance. Every Dudley chase across the schoolyard is a rehearsal in learned helplessness, teaching Harry that he is small, unwanted, and powerless unless an outside force intervenes. When that force eventually arrives, wearing half-moon glasses and speaking gently about destiny, Harry will not scrutinize the power dynamic. He will cling to it. Notice how thoroughly Dumbledore curates Harry's ignorance. No letters, no quiet visits from a friendly professor. No magical guardian appointed through the Wizengamot, even though this financial technicality forces the Ministry to recognize Harry's status as a wealthy, famous orphan with political value. A benevolent Dumbledore could have placed him with the Weasleys, with McGonagall, even with a vetted Muggle family briefed on magic. Instead, we deconstruct a timeline where he enforces isolation so absolute that Hagrid's knock becomes a religious experience. This is ritualized suffering, not random cruelty, but repeated, structured harm that encodes a specific response. Dumbledore is building a boy who will run toward pain if told it has meaning, who will accept secrecy as love, who will equate loyalty with obedience. When the door of the shack on the rock explodes inward, Harry thinks he is being rescued. In this version, the turning point arrives there. The experiment simply moves to phase 2. So, what does a conditioned weapon do when it first meets its architect? Hogwarts as a lab, the Philosopher's Stone trap. He meets a legend. He thinks it is a rescue. In this timeline, it is recruitment. Dumbledore does not merely accept Harry into Hogwarts. He absorbs him into a controlled environment. From the moment the letter is handed over in that ruined shack, the headmaster is not just a benevolent educator. He is an architect who has finally gained physical custody of his most promising weapon, within walls he controls, under rules he writes. The experiment that began on Privet Drive now acquires corridors, moving staircases, and a basement. Enter the Philosopher's Stone. In canon, Dumbledore reluctantly agrees to guard it. Here, he invites it in. He knows that a fragment of Voldemort is searching for any foothold back into reality. He knows Nicholas Flamel's research. He understands that placing a literal immortality engine in a school is not security, it is bait. The core issue is mechanical. The stone is a lure that guarantees Voldemort's shade shade will converge on Hogwarts, and guarantees that Harry, conditioned to equate danger with meaning, will converge on Voldemort. Look at the protections. On paper, a terrifying gauntlet of advanced magic. In practice, a syllabus. Fluffy can be neutralized by a song. Devil's Snare is defeated by basic plant knowledge and the willingness to stop struggling. The key room rewards broom skills a first-year seeker conveniently possesses. The chessboard demands sacrifice and courage, not NEWT-level theory. Even Snape's potion riddle is pure logic, solvable by a child with patience. We deconstruct a timeline where this is not authorial convenience, but deliberate calibration. Each obstacle is tuned to push an 11-year-old to keep going, to step forward when any rational child would fetch a teacher. Dumbledore's absences then stop being charming eccentricities and become structural. He leaves the school for the Ministry precisely when the crisis peaks. He knows Quirrell is unstable. He knows the stone is at risk. Yet he vanishes, trusting that Harry, shaped by a year of secrets, selective praise, and adult incompetence, will decide that going down the trapdoor is an act of loyalty rather than a catastrophic breach of rules. The subtext is brutal. Dumbledore is not preventing child endangerment. He is measuring it. In the final chamber, the divergence is finalized. Dumbledore allows Quirrell/Voldemort to reach Harry. He has already calculated Lily's sacrificial protection, already theorized that Voldemort cannot touch the boy without consequence. This is a live-fire test. How does Harry react when death is inches away? When power literally sits in his pocket? He does not claim the stone for himself. He does not bargain. He holds to the script of self-sacrifice Dumbledore has been feeding him all year. And then, the hospital wing. Dumbledore's calm, almost amused debrief reads differently under this lens. He withholds key information, doles out partial truths, watches Harry's reactions with the detached interest of a researcher confirming hypotheses. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated the moment he awards last-minute house points. He is rewarding not just bravery, but obedience to his narrative. The boy woke, faced death, refused temptation, and emerged more loyal than before. Phase 1 is complete. So what happens when a headmaster who is satisfied with his prototype begins planning for a prophecy, a war, and a very controlled martyrdom? Prisoner of Azkaban, rewritten, isolation by design. Phase 1 is complete. Now the core issue is mechanical. How do you maintain control over a weapon you only see 2/3 of the year in a castle full of potential rivals for his loyalty? Year 3 answers that question with precision. In canon, Dumbledore is the benevolent historian of the Marauders. He knows James, Sirius, Lupin, and Peter as students. He knows about their Animagus project. He knows they defied him, broke rules, and still earned his trust. He employs Lupin. He knows Sirius is Harry's godfather. He has the Pensieve, the Order's archives, and direct access to McGonagall, who personally handed baby Harry to that black-haired boy on a flying motorbike. In this timeline, we deconstruct a timeline where that level of knowledge makes his silence about Sirius's imprisonment something far darker. 12 years of Azkaban for a man Dumbledore could have investigated with a single Veritaserum-backed hearing, or at least questioned more aggressively. Instead, he allows the Ministry to hunt Sirius as a mass murderer, never pushing for a trial, never leveraging his political capital to reopen the case. What does that mean? If he is not simply distracted, but strategic, it means a Godfather is more dangerous to his design than a Dementor, which brings us to the Dementors at Hogwarts. In canon, Dumbledore reluctantly accepts them. Here, imagine that reluctance as performance. Harry's worst memory is the echo of his parents' murder. Dementors force that memory to the surface again and again until the boy's neurology wires fear, love, and death into a single reflex. He learns the Patronus not as a shield against generic evil, but as a ritualized rehearsal of his own trauma. The subtext is brutal. Keep Harry's nervous system calibrated to the night his parents died, and you keep him emotionally frozen at the origin point of his loyalty to Dumbledore's war. Lupin threatens that structure. Remus is kind, competent, and crucially, he teaches Harry practical magic, untainted by grand narratives about destiny. He offers chocolate after Dementor attacks, names the trauma, and provides coping mechanisms that do not run through the headmaster's office. For one school year, Harry experiences what a stable, alternative mentor looks like. So Dumbledore lets him in, and then he lets him be exposed. He knows Snape's hatred. He knows the risk of a werewolf on staff in a bigoted society. Yet he does nothing to shield Lupin's secret when the Shrieking Shack incident gives Snape the perfect pretext. The turning point arrives when Lupin forgets his wolfsbane and transforms. By the end of the year, Remus is pushed out, framed as a danger, his resignation conveniently accepted. The potential replacement in Harry's emotional hierarchy is removed, with clean bureaucratic hands. Meanwhile, the Shrieking Shack itself becomes a case study in controlled inaction. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Sirius, Lupin, and Pettigrew create the perfect evidentiary storm. Eyewitnesses, a living dead man, a confessed traitor. Dumbledore hears the account. In canon, he believes them, but he never forces a public trial, never drags Fudge back to the castle, never uses his immense power to clear Sirius's name. The divergence is finalized. Harry's one legal guardian remains a fugitive, reachable only through secret letters and stolen nights. If Dumbledore is willing to sacrifice Harry's godfather and his mental health to preserve that isolation, what does he do when the prophecy, the Horcrux in Harry's scar, and the prospect of a controlled martyrdom move from theory into operational reality? The prophecy as bait, information control, and child soldiers. The prophecy is not a mystery in this timeline, it is a leash. Listen to the wording again. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. In canon, Dumbledore delays, hesitates, claims he cannot bear to burden a child. Here, that delay becomes functional. The core issue is mechanical. A weapon that understands its own design might refuse to fire. So he gives Harry fragments, years late, just enough to keep him moving toward Voldemort, never enough to let him question the architecture of his own fate. He lets Harry overhear Trelawney's first prediction in pieces, filters it through Snape, through the Ministry, through the Pensieve. Each mediation is a gate. Each gate is controlled by Dumbledore. Harry knows he is chosen, but not that he is engineered, a Horcrux, a sacrificial vessel, a boy whose death will cleanly remove a piece of soul that Dumbledore cannot safely touch himself. The subtext is brutal. Ignorance is not an accident, it is operational security. Then we arrive at 5th year. On paper, Dumbledore's army is teenage rebellion, born in the back room of the Hog's Head. In reality, it is a training camp he does not meaningfully stop. He vanishes from Harry's life, refuses to meet his eyes, and in that vacuum, a parallel institution forms. Students drilling disarming charms, shield charms, patronuses. He officially opposes children in war, but he never shuts down the corridor where they practice stunning each other into unconsciousness. Why would an evil Dumbledore tolerate this? Because it solves 3 problems at once. It hardens a generation of fighters without him having to sign the orders. It creates a loyal cadre whose first experience of organized resistance is tied to Harry, the future martyr he intends to spend, and it proves which teenagers will keep secrets, follow instructions, and stand their ground under pressure. He is running psychological load tests on children. Across the order, the pattern repeats. Dumbledore always knows enough to override. He withholds the full prophecy from the Ministry, withholds Horcrux theory from the Order, withholds his own cursed hand from almost everyone. Information flows upward, never outward. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated, but the structure of ignorance remains intact. In this configuration, Harry, the Order, and the Ministry are not partners. They are compartments in a long, cold experiment, and through it all, he praises Harry's instinct to die for others. You are protected, in short, by your ability to love. In canon, this is comfort. Here, it is calibration. Every compliment about self-sacrifice is a nudge toward accepting that when the time comes, walking into death is not tragedy, but duty. The greater good returns as a quiet refrain, not shouted in youthful manifestos with Grindelwald, but whispered in a headmaster's office to a boy who trusts him. Pattern interrupt. Shift the camera. Imagine McGonagall watching her lions drill in the room of requirement, realizing the headmaster never truly tries to dismantle this militia. Imagine Molly Weasley hearing about the DA, about the Department of Mysteries, about Harry's near death, and noticing that Dumbledore's response is sorrowful, but never surprised. At what point do they understand that this war is not being ended quickly because its architect needs it to run long enough to finish shaping his perfect weapon? That is the fracture that will define the endgame. Snape, the pawn who killed a king. So if that fracture defines the endgame, who does Dumbledore choose to make the final move? And what happens when the supposed most courageous act in the series is just another mechanism in his machine? We deconstruct a timeline where the man on the astronomy tower is not a tragic mentor, but an engineer of loyalty. Canon gives us a simple bargain. Severus Snape, drowning in guilt over Lily's death, comes to Dumbledore begging for her protection. When she dies anyway, that guilt metastasizes into a lifelong penance. Dumbledore extracts a promise: protect the boy for her. Years later, cursed by the ring Horcrux, he adds a second clause: when the time is right, Severus must be the one to kill him. It reads as mercy, it functions as control. In the evil Dumbledore frame, the core issue is mechanical. That request is a multi-layered spell with no wand movement at all. First, it binds Snape irrevocably. Once he kills the headmaster, there is no psychological path back to Voldemort, no plausible neutrality, only deeper dependence on the one man who understands him. Second, it guarantees Dumbledore a martyr's death in full public view, a tableau of supposed self-sacrifice that will fossilize his saintly image at the exact moment his physical body becomes an inconvenient liability. Remember, this is a body already cursed, already on a countdown. An ethical leader would retire, disclose, delegate. A strategist obsessed with power does something colder. He weaponizes his own mortality. The subtext is brutal. By engineering his death as an execution carried out by his most compromised follower, he removes a failing piece from the board, while turning the act of euthanasia into a loyalty test that can never be failed, because the test is the crime itself. Snape's love for Lily becomes the leash that never loosens. Dumbledore does not simply comfort a grieving man, he curates the grief, keeps it raw, returns to Lily's memory whenever he needs compliance. Protect the boy, for her. End my life, for her. Each order is framed as a step toward redemption, so that even the most morally horrific command can be rationalized as progress. What do you do? If refusing Dumbledore feels identical to betraying Lily all over again, you obey. Then, the Half-Blood Prince year arrives, and the divergence is finalized. Dumbledore has almost all the Horcrux information, but he withholds critical structure from both Harry and Snape. He sends a 16-year-old on escalating missions, from the Cave of Inferi to private confrontations with Draco, not because there are no adult alternatives, but because he needs Voldemort to see a pattern. Harry is reckless, alone, manipulable. Simultaneously, he times his own death to maximize Voldemort's overconfidence and the world's nostalgia for good Dumbledore. Watch the sequence on the tower through that lens. Dumbledore immobilizes Harry, ensuring a traumatized eyewitness who will canonize the legend. He allows Draco to disarm him, theatrically, to preserve the boy's soul for later use. Then he turns to Snape and cashes in every debt. This is not a sacrifice, it is an exit strategy. He dies at the exact moment his posthumous influence will be strongest. The Order shattered, the Ministry compromised. Harry primed to follow the breadcrumbs he left. The war now unfolds in a world ruled by Dumbledore's memory, not his body, and that is precisely what he needs for the next phase of his design. Because if the dead headmaster still controls the living pieces, we have to ask, whose victory does the Battle of Hogwarts actually represent? Horcruxes and Hallows, designing an unwinnable game. If the dead headmaster still controls the living pieces, then the next question is simple and terrifying. What kind of game did he actually design? What if the Horcrux hunt and the Deathly Hallows myth are not desperate improvisations, but the two halves of a rigged tournament bracket where Dumbledore wins, no matter who reaches the final? Begin with the Horcruxes. In canon, Dumbledore moves through Half-Blood Prince as a weary detective, following faint trails and half-guesses. In this timeline, we deconstruct a timeline where that performance is intentional theater. He has suspected Tom Riddle's Horcrux obsession since the diary, has access to Grindelwald-era research on soul magic, and has already mapped most hiding places before Harry ever learns the word. The core issue is mechanical. Harry is not being sent to discover Horcruxes. He is being sent to rehearse obedience under lethal conditions. Notice the structure of the hunt. Each mission isolates a small cluster of young heroes, Harry, Ron, Hermione, occasionally a Weasley sibling, from the main war effort. On the surface, this is narrative focus. Under an evil Dumbledore, it becomes asset sequestration. Remove potential rival leaders from Hogwarts and the Order. Keep them chasing clues through cursed lockets and frozen lakes, and you both test their loyalty and prevent them from forming independent power bases on the real battlefield. Then, there are the Hallows. In canon, Dumbledore frames his youthful obsession as a moral failure he outgrew. Here, the divergence is finalized in Godric's Hollow, not in remorse. Ariana's death does not cure his hunger to master death, it refines it. He learns that he personally cannot be trusted with absolute power, so he externalizes the risk. Someone else will chase the wand, the stone, the cloak. Someone sufficiently traumatized, sufficiently malleable. That is why he curates myth instead of issuing orders. He withholds the Hallows from Harry for 6 books, then drops the tale of the 3 brothers at the exact psychological moment when Harry is grieving, hunted, and desperate for structure. Simultaneously, he ensures that Voldemort hears of the Elder Wand through Wandlore whispers and Grindelwald's downfall, 2 enemies, 1 legend, both drawn inexorably toward the same artifacts Dumbledore once coveted. The subtext is brutal. Whether Harry chooses Horcruxes over Hallows, or Voldemort pursues the wand and ignores the rest, both are moving inside a narrative frame Dumbledore authored. If Harry survives, he emerges as the boy who defeated death by embracing sacrifice, perfectly positioned to endorse any future Dumbledore doctrine on security, secrecy, and education. If Voldemort wins, he does so wielding a Hallows-saturated mythology that justifies a global crackdown when resistance finally topples him, because Dumbledore's true victory condition is not Harry living or Voldemort dying. It is a magical world so traumatized by war, so centralized around Hogwarts and the Ministry, that any policy stamped with his memory passes without serious resistance. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. Permanent emergency becomes the new reality, and if the chessboard has been this rigged from the start, then the Battle of Hogwarts is not a last stand at all. It is the final movement of a symphony he composed decades earlier. So what does that battle look like when the smiling headmaster was never on our side, and every corridor, password, and prophecy has been tuned to his design? The final battle, reforged, Voldemort as rival, not monster. The castle burns. Hogwarts is under siege, but in this timeline, the flames feel less random, less chaotic. Every collapsing staircase, every ceiling door, every sudden, convenient bottleneck is not just wartime improvisation. It is the visible eruption of decades of invisible architecture, the moment when Dumbledore's long-term planning stops being abstract and starts killing people. We deconstruct a timeline where the Battle of Hogwarts is not a desperate last stand against a singular monster, but a 3-way collision of designs. Death Eaters hammer the shields on the grounds. Students and teachers scramble through secret passages that, on closer inspection, are not escapes at all, but channels. The Room of Requirement disgorges fighters precisely where resistance will be most photogenic. The statues that awaken, the protective wards that fail, only after a suitably tragic interval. These are not accidents. The core issue is mechanical. This castle has been tuned for years to produce a particular narrative of sacrifice. Opposite that narrative stands Voldemort. Not as the ultimate evil, but as Dumbledore's dark mirror, cruder, noisier, less disciplined in his magic and his politics. Both men weaponize prophecy, both accept children's corpses as collateral. One builds a cult of personality around fear and open domination, the other around benevolence and carefully rationed truth. The subtext is brutal. They are competing engineers of the same society, arguing over whether power should wear a skull mask or a kindly beard. On the ground, this reframes every duel. When McGonagall drives Snape from the Great Hall, whose script is she following? When the Order rallies in the courtyard, how many of them are still moving according to plans Dumbledore whispered years earlier, unable to see that the author is dead, but the structure persists? Even the Defenders' loyalty becomes morally unstable. They are protecting children and, unintentionally, the edifice of the man who groomed those children for war. Then, Harry dies. King's Cross is no longer a moment of pure comfort. It is a sales meeting in white light. Dumbledore, serene and regretful, presents 2 options, but his framing is anything but neutral. He emphasizes the chance to go back, to complete the work, to let Voldemort fall in a way that confirms every prophecy, every calculated omission. In this reading, he is not guiding Harry to self-actualization. He is protecting the coherence of his story. Alternate outcomes branch here. In 1, Harry breaks the script. He recognizes that returning on Dumbledore's terms means endorsing the entire psychological apparatus that produced him as a weapon, so he goes back, but refuses the neat final duel. He exposes Snape's memories publicly before the last curses fly, fractures the loyalty structure of both sides, and the victory that follows is messy, improvised, and politically catastrophic. Voldemort dies, but so does the myth of the infallible headmaster. In another, Harry obeys the emotional gravity of that conversation. He returns, walks into the Great Hall, claims the Elder Wand through technical mastery of wand lore, and kills Voldemort in a single elegant reversal. The divergence is finalized. The world believes it has overthrown darkness, yet the ideological blueprint Dumbledore left behind, sacrificial children, secret-keeping, charismatic central authority, remains intact, untouchable, sanctified by victory. So what happens the morning after? When grief subsides, ledgers are balanced, and people begin quietly adding up the bodies and the lies, and realize that the real Dark Lord wore purple robes and a kindly smile? Who do you put on trial when the villain is the foundation of your new reality? Aftermath, a world built on a beautiful lie. You do not dismantle a myth with a single headline, you embalm it in marble first. In the immediate aftermath, the wizarding world does what traumatized societies always do when victory feels fragile. It builds monuments. A 50-foot statue of Albus Dumbledore rises in the Ministry atrium, wand raised, phoenix in full flight. Hogwarts renames one of the towers Dumbledore Spire, and there is serious debate about replacing one of the houses entirely. First years are handed textbooks with glossy plates of Dumbledore's final stand, the narrative pre-printed. He sacrificed everything. He guided the boy who lived. He was the light in the dark. The paper trail of his real choices stays where he left it, locked in private correspondence, buried in sealed Wizengamot files, swirling silently in pensive vials no one has permission to access. The core issue is mechanical. History in this timeline is not a record, it is an instrument of regime stability. A ministry that spent years outsourcing its moral compass to Dumbledore cannot afford to admit that compass pointed straight into the abyss, so they codify his legend in curriculum, in commemorative galleons, and mandatory remembrance ceremonies. Quietly, they classify anything that contradicts the official story under the vaguest possible label, wartime operational necessity. But archives have edges, and that is where Hermione Granger lives. Working on a post-war legal reform project, she begins to notice dates that do not line up, authorizations that should not exist, signatures that appear on documents Dumbledore was supposedly nowhere near. Why was the prophecy file accessed 3 times in 1 week by consultants who do not exist? Why do early drafts of protective legislation reference Harry as an asset, not a child? As she pulls one thread, the timeline of the war starts to warp. The subtext is brutal. This was not improvisation under pressure. This was design. McGonagall, now headmistress, finds herself replaying old conversations in her office, the same office where his portraits watch her with painted benevolence. His insistence on leaving Harry with the Dursleys, framed as protection, now reads as controlled deprivation. His refusal to intervene more directly against Umbridge, once interpreted as trust in the students, begins to resemble experimentation. When she revisits Snape's memories in the pensive, the emotional dynamic inverts. What looked like proof of Dumbledore's goodness, his willingness to die, his tenderness toward a broken man, reframes as evidence of cold calculus, a general arranging for his own martyrdom because it will buy him unassailable moral capital. The turning point arrives, not with a confession, but with a political memo. A junior undersecretary proposes a commission to investigate strategic irregularities during the war. The response from the minister is immediate and emphatic. Absolutely not. Public trust is a finite resource. Admitting that the wizarding world followed a manipulator for decades would shatter the fragile post-war structure. The divergence is finalized in that refusal. From that moment, the government's position is clear. Dumbledore is a hero, by law if not by truth. So the ethical question metastasizes in private. If his manipulations did, in fact, lead to Voldemort's defeat and a demonstrably safer world, does the original greater good argument regain any weight? Was the cost? Children weaponized, friends sacrificed, trauma industrialized, an unforgivable atrocity, or a necessary horror in a world where magic amplifies every mistake? Different survivors answer differently. Harry, caught between loyalty and revulsion, becomes the most unreliable witness of all. Pattern interrupt, jump 50 years. A Muggle studies classroom at Hogwarts, now wired with projectors and enchanted whiteboards, hosts a seminar titled Albus Dumbledore, Hero, Villain, or Necessary Monster. Students argue over digitized pensive excerpts and declassified ministry files. One cites casualty statistics and insists the outcomes justify the methods. Another points to orphanage records and broken families, arguing that any victory built on children's bodies is structurally annihilated from the start. The professor does not resolve the debate. Instead, they end with a question that folds back over the entire timeline. When your entire reality is built on a beautiful lie, is tearing it down an act of justice or a second catastrophe? And in the corridor outside, the stone statue of Dumbledore still stands. No plaque can agree on what, precisely, he saved. Reading the books backwards, which kind? Acts turned sinister. So now, walk back into the books with one quiet alteration in your head. What if the twinkle in Dumbledore's eye was not mercy, but surveillance? The sherbet lemons come first, a charming quirk, a headmaster who loves Muggle sweets, or, under this revised structure, a calculated entry ritual. He offers sugar in the office to lower defenses, to watch how people accept gifts, to log their tells. The core issue is mechanical. Every encounter with him is data collection, disguised as whimsy. Reread that first feast. He stands, he jokes about a few words before bed. He says nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak, and the hall laughs. On the surface, it is nonsense. Under the evil Dumbledore lens, it is a dominance display. He controls the emotional temperature of hundreds, with a single absurdity, testing just how easily the entire reality of Hogwarts will follow his lead. Consider the gentle speeches about love. In canon, they are the moral spine of the series. Here, they become the operating system of a long con. When he tells Harry in the hospital wing that love is a power Voldemort knows not, the subtext is brutal. He is identifying the exact fuel source that will keep Harry walking toward his own death without ever needing the Imperious Curse. Now compress the timeline. First year, the stone. In the standard reading, the protections are elaborate but flawed. Under this framework, we deconstruct a timeline where the stone is bait, not treasure, and an 11-year-old is stress-tested for willingness to die in a corridor of enchanted chess. Third year, Sirius. The headmaster who can move the ministry with a letter somehow cannot exonerate an innocent man, but he can arrange a hippogriff jailbreak that leaves Harry with no stable guardian but himself. Fifth year, the DA. He appears to oppose it, then allows it to flourish in the room of requirement, quietly manufacturing a paramilitary youth wing without ever signing his name. Seventh, the Hallows. He drip-feeds myth and half-truths so that Harry will chase exactly far enough to be useful, never far enough to become independent. Pause here and make it personal. Which scene has always felt wrong to you? The baby on the doorstep with a letter and no supervision. The decision to withhold the prophecy until after Sirius dies. The calculated delay in telling Harry he is a Horcrux. Now, imagine Dumbledore's internal monologue in that moment, not as a regretful grandfather, but as a strategist optimizing a weapon's trajectory. At what point in this version of reality would you stop trusting him? Chamber of Secrets? The graveyard in Little Hangleton? The lightning-struck tower? Or does your loyalty fracture only when the divergence is finalized in King's Cross, and you realize he is still editing the narrative even in death? And then the larger question arrives. If this reading were true, could Harry ever fully escape his influence, or has the headmaster already colonized the moral language through which Harry understands the world? Because this is no longer only about one wizard with too much power. This is about how easily readers accept a comforting authority figure who says for the greater good, and how quickly we excuse structural harm when the architect smiles, offers us a sherbet lemon, and promises that the catastrophe was necessary. Your turn at the chessboard. Choose the next what if. So where does that leave us at the end of this particular fracture in the Harry Potter timeline? What happens to the story we thought we knew when the smiling headmaster is the architect of the catastrophe, not its savior? In this episode, we deconstruct a timeline that has been hiding in plain sight. We began with a boy in Godric's Hollow, and a young man in Godric's Hollow, Ariana's death, Grindelwald's fall, and that intoxicating phrase for the greater good stopped being a regrettable phase and became the moment the divergence is finalized. The first Wizarding War was no longer a clash between light and dark, but a controlled burn in which Dumbledore managed the spread of Voldemort's fire, pruning the wizarding world into the shape he wanted. We walked through Harry's childhood on Privet Drive, and their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated when you accept that he was not misplaced, but warehoused. The stone at Hogwarts became bait, not protection. Sirius's imprisonment stopped being a tragic oversight and turned into a calculated removal of an inconvenient guardian. Each year, the pattern repeated. A new threat, a new test, a headmaster who never quite intervened until the lesson had drawn blood. By the time we reached the prophecy, the core issue is mechanical. This was not a warning, this was a design brief. Harry as Horcrux, Harry as weapon, Harry as sacrificial lamb. Snape's redemption, reoriented into the psychological leash Dumbledore wrapped around a Death Eater's throat, and the Horcrux hunt became an obstacle course constructed by the very man pretending to hand over the map. In the final battle, Voldemort shrank. The rival Dark Lord in the forest was terrifying, yes, but the subtext is brutal. The real power had been in the headmaster's office all along, drafting children into a war whose victory conditions only he understood. That is the central takeaway of this entire experiment. Not that this is secretly the one true reading of canon, but that flipping a single character's alignment tightens plot holes, intensifies themes of trauma and loyalty, and forces us to interrogate why we trusted him so easily. So now, it is your turn at the chessboard. If Dumbledore is evil, which one scene would you rewrite first? And how would that change ripple outward? Do you start with the Mirror of Erised, with Dumbledore quietly editing Harry's reflection? Do you rewrite the moment on the Astronomy Tower, so that the wand movement, the words, the power exchanged, all land differently? Drop your chosen scene in the comments, and walk us through the new dynamic. Trace the structure. Follow the psychological fallout. Does your change redeem someone we dismissed, or condemn someone we thought was safe? And if you want to keep deconstructing this reality, tell me where we go next. Do we move to a world where Snape raises Harry from infancy, and the turning point arrives in a kitchen, not a dungeon? Do we examine a Hogwarts where Voldemort actually wins on that battlefield, and the Resistance has to rebuild magic under occupation? Or do we hand the prophecy to Hermione and watch the entire narrative reorient around a different kind of chosen one? Vote for the next What If in the comments. Because after you have seen Dumbledore as the Dark Lord in the headmaster's chair, one thing becomes clear. In a future episode, another beloved character is going to flip, and when they do, you may realize that no one in the wizarding world was ever as trustworthy as you wanted them to be.